Welcome, everyone. Welcome, colleagues, friends, to the second lecture in our lecture series on the road to Glasgow, on the road to COP26 and CMA3. This lecture series is co-organized by the National University of Singapore Center for International Law and its director, Professor Nilofer Oral, together with the Durham University and Petra Minorop, and the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. And today we are so lucky to have with us Professor David Freestone. David, Nilofer will introduce you a little later, but I just want to say that we are very, very pleased, very happy, very privileged to have you with us. You've been a dear colleague to many of us, definitely to three of us, for many, many years, and we really appreciate your deep insights in so many areas in international environmental law. You will talk today about financial and funding institutions, a very important topic, as we all know. There are very specific obligations under the Paris Agreement of developed countries to provide funding, financial support to developing countries in continuation of their obligations that they already had under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. However, in addition, there's also an invitation to everyone else to chip in. And of course, there is, in the context of a global effort, the obligation to mobilize finance towards the collective goal of $100 billion annually from 2020 onwards. And I'm sure you will talk a little bit about this. I just wanted to mention that maybe something that is not so obvious and on the radar currently. Developed countries do also have an obligation to provide projected levels or information on projected levels of finance under Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement, an obligation which they are supposed to provide biannually starting in 2020. And we have already quite a long list of countries that have put forward their communication on projected levels of finance. Now, all this is channeled through international multilateral channels like the Green Climate Fund, but also bilateral and regional channels. And it's a complex environment out there, and we're all very much looking forward to your insights and your talk today. And with that, I pass the floor on to Petra.
Thank you very much, Christina. And as you said, this is already the second lecture of our monthly preparatory lecture series on the road to COP26 and CMA3. Time goes too quickly. It's very exciting to have you here today. David, thank you so much for agreeing to give your lecture today. And thank you also to the audience and of course to Nilofer and Christina for organizing this with me. It's a great pleasure to be organizing this lecture series jointly. And last but not least, thank you also to Stan Neil for your continuous support with this series and the perfect organization of every detail. And just one more housekeeping matter, please, could you post your questions in the Q&A section? And then also, as it was the case for the last lecture, the recording will be made available on YouTube. And with that, I hand over to Nilofer.
Thank you so much, Christina and Petra. I am really delighted that we have for our second lecture in the series on the road to COP26 CMA3. A very dear colleague to all of us, David Freestone, and he will be talking to us today about finance and financial mechanisms, and he's particularly well qualified to talk about this. We have a bio on David, but I tell you, it only scratches the surface of just the incredible depth and expanse of knowledge and experience that David has with international environmental law, but also climate change. In addition to being a professor, he also for many years was at the World Bank, and there he was Deputy General. He was. Oh, I have it here. He was the Chief Counsel of the Environment and International Law Practice Group, and then Deputy General Counsel, Senior Advisor between 1996 and 2008. And I know from there he has a great deal of experience looking at the climate change financial mechanisms. And also, though, he's well known in the law of the sea community. He's currently Executive Secretary of the Sargasso Sea Commission. He's also co-rapporteur at the International Law Association on the work that's being done on sea level rise. He has written or edited over 30 books, authored 200 academic articles. I mean, really, I can go on, but really, we're so happy to have you, David. And I know you have a wonderful presentation. I've had a sneak preview, and you will give our participants a great overview of beginning with, I think, the origin of the financial mechanism or the climate regime. And so at this point, without stealing time from you, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Nilufer. Very generous intro, and thanks to all of you. Nice to see you all. Thank you, Christina and Petra as well. It's a great pleasure to be here and to follow in the steps of my dear friend Dan Bodansky, who set a fairly high bar for the first session. So I thought the best way of paying tribute to that was to copy the first two slides. I wouldn't use the word steal because he's agreed, but I've used his picture of the Glasgow Conference Centre where the meeting is going to be held, and I've actually got another picture which I've got behind me. So I thought the closest I could get in times of COVID to Glasgow is to have the backdrop of the Glasgow Centre. So I'm going to talk about the financial and funding mechanisms, and it's really an overview. As Nilufer said very generously, I've been actually following the BBNJ discussions, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction discussions, quite carefully. And so I haven't actually been following the details of the Article 6 negotiations, but you've got detailed presentations by Christina on transparency framework, etc., and Petra on the rule book coming up. So this is a little bit of a taster, and I thought it'd be good to give us a little bit of a sort of back view of this. And what I loved about Dan's presentation was that he divided it into a play with 4 acts. That's his slide. So those are his first 2 slides. And after that, it's pure plagiarism, because I thought that I'd actually see if I could do it. Fits quite well into the development of the financial and funding mechanisms as well. So Act 1, which is the convention itself, is the GF, the establishment and then the restructuring of the GF. Then in Act 2, we have Kyoto, but we have the trading mechanisms and the market mechanisms, which are going to be so important, I think, to meet those targets that we've been talking about, but also the 3 funds set up by the Marrakesh meeting, the Adaptation Fund, the Least Developed Country Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund. And then we move on to the age of the Copenhagen Accord. And in the meantime, a bit of treading water, because the disappointment of Copenhagen. I remember that Dan and I swapped articles on this in 2009. He called it a paradigm shift, and I called it a train wreck. I think we were probably both slightly right, but he's probably true that it's a paradigm shift we now see in the Paris Agreement. So anyway, in the meantime, we see the development of the Climate Fund. We also see other funds like the climate investment funds, which people may not be aware of, which are run by the World Bank. And then in the last phase, of course, we see that the Green Climate Fund and the GF, both as operational entities of the Paris Agreement. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look in a little bit of detail. As I said, there's quite a lot to cover, and I'm notorious for having far too many slides and have to move through them fairly quickly. So I've got a lot of pictures as well. Because this could be fairly dry stuff, so I'm fairly keen to try and keep everybody awake, at least in my time. It's quite early in my morning. So those are the frame. Then I'll end with just a few comments about the 26 meeting. I like this idea of having recurrent themes, and you can see that this is, again, well, I suppose this is also nicked from Dan, but with different content. So what you see here is one of the recurrent themes is that the parties are always pressing new and additional resources, right? Incremental cost, new money, additionality. These are the things that the parties are pressing for. Copenhagen, we say the commitment to scaled up new and additional predictable adequate funding, financial flows with pathways, it says scaled up, that's Paris. So that consistent flow, and the differentiation, of course, is between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. So that's of course, in the Framework Convention. It's also in the requirements of Kyoto very, very pronouncedly, and still some differentiation even in Copenhagen. There's a line in the middle, and I sort of took it out. There is also another theme, which I think we have to sort of address fairly importantly in this debate, and that is lack of certainty about commitments which developed countries are making. If you like, you could call it mistrust, if you like, but there is a legacy of that. That there's some of the contributions, some of the fairly substantial resources that countries are making available. It's not quite clear where they're going, whether they're being double counted, etc. So there are some other themes as well, but we'll pick those up as we go. So I'm starting with the first ones. So my thanks to Dugu Chirchek, who found these pictures actually on the Framework Convention website. A picture of the 1990 climate conference, which actually shows Mrs. Thatcher, I see. But 1990 agreement was, of course, the agreement set up the IPCC. And then on the right, look, Michael Cotillard, the first Secretary General, looking very dapper, and a very youthful Angela Merkel as well. So it's really a wonderful picture. So more to the subject of the GF. So the idea of a global environment facility or an environment oriented fund of this kind was actually an idea of the Brundtland Commission in '87. It was then, and actually that was from an idea which the World Resources Institute had put forward a couple of years before. A German and French proposal to the World Bank Board in 1990 for this fund, for a fund of this kind, was put forward, which was received quite well. And so in 1991, the World Bank, which joined then with UNDP and UNEP, to establish a pilot phase for a global environment facility with a billion Swiss special drawing rights, about $1.2 billion. And the World Bank was going to be the trustee, but joined with implementation with UNDP and UNEP. So for those of you who don't know much about the World Bank, a few general comments first. So my predecessor, in '96, I was appointed, as Nilufer says, as the legal advisor for environment. My predecessor had been Peter Sand, who was the head of the Secretariat for the UNCED meeting. And his famous phrase was that the World Bank was the preferred villain of the environmental movement. And I think that was certainly true during the '80s and '90s, perhaps into this century as well. But the World Bank has changed substantially, but it was in the process of changing at that point. For example, when I joined in '96, one of the other people who joined that same month as me was actually Bob Watson, who was at that point the chair of the IPCC. The head of the Environment Department was Andrew Steer, who then went on to become, he's head of the WRI, he's just been appointed head of this new fund that Bezos has set up, but he was also the roving ambassador for climate for the UK. So quite a lot of very talented people involved in trying to change the direction of this particular ship. But one of the problems that the environmental movement has had with the World Bank and the developing countries as well is that its method of decision-making is based on the board of directors. And the voting structure of the board of directors is on share contributions. So the capital contributions which the shareholders have made, and the richest countries have made the biggest contributions, and those that everybody has to make a certain contribution. I think even the poorest countries have to make a pledge of at least $4 million. They may not have to actually pony up the money at that point, but the whole point about this is this pledged capital from some of the richest countries in the world, and it's against those pledges that the World Bank can raise bonds and borrow money, which it then lends off on at lower rates because it's a AAA institution with high credit rating. So that's the way it operates. But that means that the board makes decisions not necessarily on the basis of one state, one vote. And that was the sticking point for the negotiations of the '92 agreement, the UNFCCC. So the idea of a financial mechanism was taken on enthusiastically, but there was a feeling that it shouldn't be the World Bank board that was making the decisions and how this money should be spent. And so you see in Article 11.2 an idea of that the financial mechanism should have an equitable and balanced representation of all the parties with a transparent system of governance. And it says in Article 23 talks about the GF, which has been established by the bank as being, can be the, act on an interim basis until an appropriate restructuring has taken place to enable it to meet the requirements of Article 11. So that's kind of the agenda that was, and that's been a theme, I think, of one of the issues which we see carrying on through time. The instrument, after 4 sessions, I think, fairly grueling and fairly confrontational negotiations, I'm told, the instrument for the establishment of a restructured GF was agreed. And it was approved by this same process. So this is quite an interesting international law point, that this is an international agreement, but it's not a treaty. It's actually the resolutions of 3 other international bodies that are setting it up. And we see that sort of coming in a slightly different iteration in the Green Climate Fund. So the idea was that it should have an assembly of all the parties, and I put in brackets because that's the number of parties there are at the moment, but not in the instrument. 186 now parties meet every, I put four years in brackets because actually the instrument says every 3 years, but it's actually met every 4. And as I was the legal advisor, I did actually point out before the second meeting that this was not actually what the instrument said, and I was dismissed as being legalistic, which is an abusive term for lawyers when you don't like what they say. But the fact remains that the instrument still says every 3 years, and it meets every 4. So it's a council of 32, and it's a sort of mixed procedure because it should say 14. That I lost my, so the fault on my scribe. There's 14 developed countries, 16 developing countries, and with 2 economies in transition. It meets twice a year, and it has a mixed voting system. So there's something of the Bretton Woods institutions in that. It has it acts by unanimity, but in the absence of unanimity, there is a weighted voting system. I could go into that if you want to. The Secretariat is headed by the CEO, and doesn't have independent personality. So its personality is dependent on the privileges and immunities that it has derived from the World Bank, even though it's guaranteed to be functionally independent. It's located in the HQ and actually physically in a separate building. Just a brief view of that. You see, one of the issues with the GF is that it's been given a lot of other responsibilities as well. So in Rio, biological diversity and climate change, 94, land degradation was added with the Desertification Convention. It calls itself the finance. This is one of their own slides. It calls itself the financial mechanism. We can look back at that. It's actually an operating entity of the financial mechanism, as I think Christina pointed out. And it then adds Stockholm Convention. It becomes the desertification, as well as I said, and the Minamata Convention. So it's got a large range of treaty responsibilities, as well as issues like forests and international waters, which don't have a treaty basis. So there's a feel that climate change is not quite its premier. It's a major, but it's not its premier or only responsibility. It works on a system of replenishment every 4 years. So every 4 years, the donors are reassembled. There's a review of what's happened, and then more pledges are made. And we're in the 7th replenishment now, started in 2018. So they call it GF7. And you can see that there was initially a fairly exponential increase, which and look at the years in that 2005, 2006, 7, and 10, we're talking about the financial crisis, 2008. So there's a little, financial hardship, but also a little bit of donor fatigue there. And then we go up into the 4 billions, and it's really been steady funding at that. But they also claim, and it's true, I know because the assessments look at this, that they're able to leverage quite a lot of extra money for 88. They say 20 billion they've spent, which is about 88 billion leverage. So quite a big impact, 4,000 projects in 170 countries. And then we come on to the Act 2. So all this continues, but Act 2, we add to this, and this is the Kyoto Protocol, 97. I remember entered into force in 2005. And it took till 2001 to have, looking at the Paris rule book, remember Marrakesh was like 4 years on before we actually get to the Marrakesh rule book. It's called the Marrakesh Accords, of course. And remember that it's been overplayed a bit, but or underplayed, the first commitment period, or if you like, the commitment period, 2008, 2012, was only intended to be the first one. And there was a second one, which is in Doha, which paradoxically the Doha amendments came into force on the month that they actually the commitments ended. So there is a second commitment period, which has more vigorous reduction targets, but it lost a lot of its key players there, Russia, Japan. Right, so that's just basic. Everybody's aware of this. So apologies for those who know all this stuff. But it is worth making the point about trading, because legally binding emission targets with an emphasis on domestic reductions, and this unique features as the first international instrument to have a financial trading mechanism. And there are three basic concepts here. I'll look at those in a bit detail. So your basic obligation is domestic policies and measures. You have to introduce domestic measures to meet your obligations, but to assist you as supplementary means, and there's an argument between two camps as to what supplementary meant in that context. You may remember as to whether it means 50% or 99%. Emissions trading, which is the classic, I call that the classic cap and trade. You put a cap on everybody and then they trip it. And this is the financial argument for it, from doing this, that they find the most financially acceptable means amongst themselves, the cheapest way of meeting their obligations by trading amongst themselves. That's the cap and trade. And then we have these two other mechanisms, and I'll just move on to that a little bit. These two other mechanisms, joint implementation and the clean development mechanism. And again, those of you, Kyoto is so passé, right? But still, these things are really still quite important mechanisms, which we may be looking at again. Joint implementation, and that's, if you like, cap and trade, but it's a project-based cap and trade. So you're allowed to trade between two countries, two developed countries that have caps, can finance projects in each other's country and take advantage of the emission reductions generated, the emission reduction units. And the idea of an emission reduction is itself slightly bizarre, because it's something that didn't happen, right? So you couldn't see a ton of CO2. That's invisible, and if it didn't happen, if it was a reduction, it's not there. So you're actually trading, and something has value that actually never existed as a result of your action. So it's a kind of bizarre concept, but it's actually been quite an effective idea. I'll give you an example. Actually, when I first joined the bank, this was pre-Kyoto implementation. The Framework Convention had actually envisaged using. It talks about meeting obligations individually or jointly. So there was a pilot project called Activities Implemented Jointly, and the World Bank took on a fund from the Norwegians just to show how this might work. Nobody's claiming credit for anything, just to see how it might work, where they actually funded a project where the incandescent light bulbs in a Mexican state, I think it was Oaxaca, I may be wrong, if I don't remember properly, that were all voluntarily replaced with CFCs, now old technology, but this was in the early 90s, voluntarily, of course. The result was such a drop in consumer demand that the Mexican government cancelled a contract for a new power station. So, these activities really make a difference. That's just an example of a sort of joint implementation idea. The CDM, though, is really the new concept, and that's based on what's called baseline and credit. So that's where you have a country that has a developed country that has an obligation that it invests in a country that doesn't have obligations to reduce emissions. The emissions are reduced in that country, and the developed country with the obligations claims the credit for it. So the incentives to cheat are fairly high, right? Because both countries could be the winners. And so that's why there's this fairly rigorous oversight, which is provided by the board, the executive board of the CDM, which still exists, of course. So that's a concept which, of course, still has ongoing significance because we're in our discussions of Article 6. So purchases of certified emission reductions from the CDM involved an administrative fee, but they also involve 2% share of the proceeds. And I'll come back to that because that's quite, so that doesn't mean money, that means emission reductions, CERs. So we'll look at that in a minute. So let me say a little bit more about the trading and the growth of the carbon markets, because this has been, I think, the potential for this is still really not tapped very much. Again, one of my tasks as the head of the legal group, the environment law group, was to assist the Environment Department in their first carbon fund. And this was the prototype, which was actually, they started working on this in '96, before Kyoto, really. And it was launched in 2000 with 145, then $180 million. And the idea was that when I said a little bit about that, but I'll just show you this concept. So the idea of a carbon fund is that you have government, such as this anyway, you have the industrialized countries, the Annex 1 countries, and companies as well. And you have a mix of both because if you like, this is risk capital that the governments are putting in, but they provide some area of comfort to the private sector. They invest in a series of projects, but they don't do it individually. They put the money into a jointly managed fund, and that's the fund that invests in those projects. So you get a diversity of risk and you get the shared risk of each of the projects. So whereas if you put all your money into one project and something happens, you lose it all. This is, you've shared the risk amongst a number of projects and a number of contributors, participants. So they put money into the fund, and in return they get emission reductions. They also get transfer, so money comes back then to the developed countries, the economies in transition, but they also get the technology as well, which is also an important part of it. And that prototype gave rise to a lot of other, and the bank wasn't, the purpose of this was to mobilize others to do this, to do this themselves. So that was just to show, it's like a learning by doing operation. But the more important, probably even than that, was the establishment of the European Union emissions trading system starting in 2005. And you may recall that it was the Americans who were pushing, the US who was pushing in Kyoto for there to be trading mechanisms, Article 6, Article 12, Article 17 as well. But actually, because the US didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol, so it's actually Europeans then developed what is the world's biggest emissions trading system. So that's successful too, in that sense that it helps the countries in an economic way to reduce the costs. The pilot phase was up to 2007, and then phase 2, of course, was the Kyoto period as well, and then phase 3, which is now we're into, because we still haven't got the rules for the post Kyoto, the Paris period. And the Paris period, which starts 2021. It will be, if the emissions reductions are going to be more rigorous, and it already counts for like 45% of the EU emissions. So a way of institutions to address this in the most, it's going to cost them money, but economically feasible. Let's just give you some idea of the mobilization of money involved, right? So this is this is very old, these slides aren't produced anymore, these charts, because they don't mean so much. But the point I'm trying to make with this one is that in the early days, we've looked at the amount of money that's been mobilized by the GF, for example, which in the early days was 2-3 billion. we've looked at the money that was 200,000, which was being invested. Sorry, it's about what was my carbon fund total there? 180 million, which has been mobilized by the Prototype Carbon Fund. Once you start bringing in an allowance system, the amounts of money involved become exponential, right? So it rise exponentially. So 2005, we're looking at $8 billion. By 2010, we're talking about $119 billion. So the total means the total market is 141 billion. Now, that money isn't going to developing countries, but some of it is, right? So that's some of the money which is being invested in projects to develop reductions is finding its way into the development agenda. So that's an important part of this mobilization of resources, which we have to bear in mind. So the other issue that was addressed in 2001 was Marrakesh, right? So the rules for trading, but we also at Marrakesh, we also have the adaptation fund for human face. It'd be nice to see the guy who actually runs the adaptation fund. I have faces for the others as well, but this is Miko who's Finnish. Launched in Bali, and it's funded, as I said, by the share of the proceeds of the CDM. Now, it was envisaged that that would be a very large amount of money, but look back at that chart again. So we start in 2005, we've got the EU system dwarfing everybody. Primary CDM, which is the Clean Development Mechanism, is 2.6, or quite a substantial amount, 2.6 billion. And then we look at the figures going, we go into the recession, which in 2008, but goes up 6, and then it starts to go down again. So the amount of money which is invested through the CDM is actually much smaller as a result of uncertainty about what would happen post-Kyoto, and also because of the recession. So this was set up as a fund to be administering money generated by CERs. So look at the board composition: 16 members represent parts of the Kyoto, majority of members are developing countries, 69%. And what's paradoxical that this has actually now become effectively a donor fund. Like Germany, for example, has put $100 million into this. Sweden has put a large amount, and others, lots of other donors as well. So they've actually spent nearly $1 billion since it's been going, but more than half of that is probably as a result of donors putting money into it. But the other two funds which were set up were, and the dominant one is the Least Developed Country Funds, the Least Developed Country Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. These two other funds, which were actually given to the GF to administer. Really interested. Main focus of this was implementation of the National Adaptation Programs of Action, the NAPAs at that point. Don't have to go too much into the details of all this, but about 1.4 billion dollars has been allocated. And I thought, rather than go into the detail of this, let's just look at some examples. So one of them I wanted to use is the Kiribati adaptation program, for example. And this shows you how leveraging works. So less than 2 million from the LDCDF, but substantial contributions from AusAid, from the Japan Fund, and from the government of Kiribati in kind contribution as well. So this is an area that's been hit by impacts of sea level rise. 37,000 mangroves are going to build. They're going to build walls around delicate infrastructure and collection of rainwater because of the problems of contamination of water. So that's the sort of project that we're talking about. And those of you who've been looking at this, let's just look at that. Those follow adaptation. So then the LDC, this fund has financed, bottom row here, the blue, is all the national adaptation programs of actions, the NAPAs. And then phase 1 is the development, is the NAPA, that's your program. Then you put forward a plan of action and then you implement it. So, and we can see that those phases of colors there that the LDC has been financing. And this is an evaluation that was made in 2020, which shows that about 1.4 billion, but look, 6 or 7 billion of co-financing in the way that that Kiribati project shows. Special Climate Fund really is a complementary to that, less resources, less of a clear role, but it's got about $360 million. And then the funds which people tended not to be so aware of were actually set up, again, 2008, we're running up into Copenhagen. We're not quite sure what's going to happen. It's the end of the first commitment period. Is Kyoto going to be replaced by another treaty? So a little bit of uncertainty. There was some feeling that whether this money should perhaps not go to the GF, or wanted to make sure it was dedicated for climate funding. And so 14 donors, led by the UK, which put only 3 billion of its UK money, then the US and Japan, the three main donors, put about $8.5 billion into these climate funds. It's the only multilateral fund which works only with the multilateral development bank. So it's with the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, etc. And it's spent about 2/3 of the money that it's got. There are two main windows. One is the Clean Development, Clean Technology Fund, which aims at financing mitigation actions. The first project was actually in Turkey. And then as the most recent one actually I looked up was looking at renewables in Turkey as well. And then the Strategic Climate Fund is climate resilience fund financing, forest investments, and renewable energy. So that's quite a substantial. That's more than the GF has, for example. And then we're on to the last phase, if you like, is the next phase, rather, which is the Copenhagen. Again, lovely. Again, thanks to Du for finding that rather good picture. I had one of the Chinese, Obama, shaking hands with the Chinese delegate, which sort of was not quite, it was nice to see, but this is a rather better picture of a rather wider spread of players, I think. So what did Copenhagen, just to remind ourselves, the Copenhagen Accord, it scaled up, again, this is the phrase that we're looking at, scaled up new and additional predictable and adequate funding. This is what the continual demand is. We want more money, and we want to know when it's coming, and we want to know that it's sufficient. And so the pledge was made. Those who remember the meeting that Hillary Clinton turned up halfway through the week and announced 30 billion a year from 2010 to 2012, and then Obama came at the end and suggested it should be 100 billion a year by 2020 for the developing countries. So the sort of incremental rise of this. And that's the figure which Christina mentioned at the beginning. And I will say a little bit about that, because that's, again, part of this issue of kind of some mistrust about it. It was suggested also it would be a high-level panel with alternative revenue sources, which I'll look at in a minute, and then Copenhagen Green Fund, which we talked about a little bit already, and a technology mechanism to accept, which is really important, the transfer of technology issues. So there was a fast start, which is great. The idea of let's get on with this, let's not wait for after the disappointment of the Copenhagen meeting, let's start with a new world of pledges. 23 donors pledged $28 billion. And then I think it was Jake Worksman who looked at these figures for WRI and said, it's rather difficult to make sense of them. Where's this money coming from? And this is rather kind of part of this little legacy issue, which we need to bear in mind. In the end, it was about 12 billion. It was new money that had been committed. So, everybody wants to put a big spin on things, but it can be, counterproductive. And then we come to the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board. And I looked at this again. It's quite an interesting group. So it was the two chairs initially were Gordon Brown, who was then the UK PM, and Meles Zenawi, who died in 2012, I saw. But an interesting figure. He was a university professor who left the university to lead the rebellion against the Mengistu regime, and was successful, and then became interim president and then elected PM. And then after Gordon Brown lost the election and resigned, Jens Stoltenberg took on. They're basically saying you can do this. You can do 100 billion. This was 10 years ago. You can do 100 billion a year, but it's challenging, and you need to use public finance, but you also need to use private sector. And that's part of the point that I was making about the trading mechanisms. It's not just the public purse, right? And in order to access the private purse, there has to be incentives, and they're not acting through altruism. I mean, they will use, if you like, companies, the private sector acts through, if you like, for its PR and through for image, and these are issues, but that has a financial reward. So there has to be some incentive in the system. And that's what these trading systems are intended to reach. And they said that they thought, and this is why I kind of showed you those slides earlier on, they thought the carbon price ought to be between $20 and $25 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. The course that that Nilufer took, that I teach at GW, I usually start at the beginning of the year and ask people to look up the carbon price. And in 2012, it was $3 a ton, and it pretty well bumped along at that for some time. It started to go seriously up now, right? So I think it was 25, 30 now, in the order of that. But that's the prices that it needs to be in order for the markets to generate the private sector income that we're talking about. They also thought that if you're doing allocations of allowances, you should allocate money, you should have auctions, and there's amounts. That's one of the ways you should give money to climate for international climate action as a result of the fees that you tax, if you like, from auctions of allowances, if you're going to have trading schemes. And then the other point they were making was about multilateral development banks, 1 to 4. So for every public sector dollar that is put from the banks, you need to look for at least $4 from others. And GF does that. GF now is up to, in the GF7, it's up to nearly, it's 8.8 to 1 now. And then we come to Paris, right? The famous picture with Cristiano Rodriguez. Paris agreed then, as a result of the Paris Agreement. Then we're looking at the Green Climate Fund being an operational entity under the Article 11, the financial mechanism of the Framework Convention, and the governing instrument, which was approved at COP17, is a resolution, a decision of the COP. So there we have an international instrument approved by a decision of the Conference of the Parties of the Framework Convention. It's annexed as a decision. So this is, and it gives the Climate Fund international legal personality, which is one of the things that the GF doesn't have, because it's still part of the World Bank. So that's quite an interesting, if you like, lawmaking technique. It's secretariat's based in Incheon, and it has a rigorously equal division between developed and developing countries, 2 co-chairs and 24 members, 50% developing, 50% developed, and it doesn't have a weighted voting system. It has consensus. It's also mandated to have a balanced allocation of funds. So 50% has to go to mitigation, 50% to adaptation, and at least half of its resources, adaptation resources, must be invested in the most climate vulnerable countries, SIDS, LDCs, and African states. It starts off with 10 billion, which in 2014, the first pledges, which were quite good, and this is only climate, right? So we looked at 4 billion for the GF, and this is now more than twice as much, only for climate action. And at the first replenishment in 2019, started, actually the officially published figure is 9.9, but the Austrian government put an extra 100,000 in after the end of the replenishment period. So it's actually $10 billion, led by UK, France, Germany, and Japan. Those are the 4 highest down. And the last time I looked, the US wasn't a donor to them. So that might change. So that's also good news. The trustee, interestingly, see the slight distrust, maybe even not slight, distrust the World Bank as being the trustee. So they asked them to be the interim trustee, reviewable after 3 years. After 3 years, they were reappointed, and in 2019, they were reappointed for 4 years. So so the World Bank seems to be running that. So the trustee doesn't just hold the money; it actually organises the replenishments, and the replenishments are really the so-called burden sharing arguments, where you actually have to convince governments that they're actually going to continue to contribute and negotiate with them. And it's an old process the World Bank's been working at for some time. In the 1950s, late 50s, it established the International Development Association, which is one of its concessionary arms, which actually mobilizes about 40 billion every 3 years. So the bank has a lot of experience in doing that. It's difficult to take that on from scratch. And that's the second executive director is Yannick Clemaric, a French national, who seems to be making a good job. And certainly after a rather hesitant start, they seem to be getting back under control. So they put $10 billion as capital here, and they're looking at approval, implementation, and disbursement. So 3 very important things. So first of all, are you actually going to do projects? Then secondly, have you actually started them? And then have the money changed hands? So those are different stories, 9 billion or so plus of approvals, less, and the disbursement, 7 or so, and then less than 2 billion actually money out of the door. And that's really what people want to see, is the money going out of the door. But otherwise, after a slow start, they're getting better. So look at my cursor here. They've got the time taken from 267 days, which is 10 months, down to still quite a long time, 192 days. They've reduced, there's reduction of quicker implementation by 55%. And have they managed on their other metrics? So far, so good. Adaptation here is 24%. I've got my specs on. Higher percentage, 44% for mitigation, but these mixed projects seem to have a little bit of each. So we're not quite sure what the metrics are for that, but they certainly on the issue of the countries most deserving, we're looking at fairly clearly there on the 50%. So the other agenda in the meantime is, as well as the Clean Development Fund, is there are lots of other initiatives which are going forward, and sort of on the table for ongoing with Glasgow is, of course, loss and damage. Quite a lot of activity, I think, to try and address this issue of loss and damage, but there's no it's not a compensation mechanism involved. Remember, that's quite a contentious issue. Been quite a lot of interesting developments amongst disaster risk pooling. I've got some examples here. These are terrible acronyms. I actually wrote them down. So the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, set up 2007. We've got the Pacific Catastrophic Risk Assessment and Financing Initiative. The idea is that to actually provide, to underwrite, for the development banks to underwrite some of the costs of actually taking this sort of insurance up. And the Caribbean, remember, the premiums of the private sector premiums, they've gone up a lot because they've had 5 hurricanes last year, the year before last, so they had 2 last year. So that, the risks of this have gone up. The African Risk Capacity Facility, and then the Southeast Asian Disaster Risk Insurance Facility. So these are initiatives which are going forward to try. These are outside the ambit of the L&D framework, but they actually contribute to this this idea. And we've been waiting quite a long time for this rule book, right? It's now 2021. We didn't have a meeting last year. So in the meantime, other things have happened, right? So countries have been waiting. There's been, some investments possibly which have been waiting to be made. Countries want to take advantage of the mechanisms in Article 6. The Japanese, for example, is one of the best ones, has set up this joint crediting mechanism with 17 arrangements with countries, with 17 different countries crediting bilateral arrangements, which will be ready so that when Article 6 comes into play, they can actually take advantage of it immediately. And then the other question is, what happens to the CDM? The CDM has been fairly low profile, but it's still there. And does it become part of, and what about the other, even JI, so these sorts of initiatives, but particularly the CDM? And then, you know, there's a lot of activity on the carbon market regimes outside the framework convention. Last week, I even heard on the news that the American oil producers are asking for a carbon tax. They don't want regulatory action. They want a carbon tax. They want to make their own minds up as to the way in which they address the issues of decarbonisation. And a very useful facility is this climate-focused, Charlotte Streck's organization has this voluntary carbon market dashboard, which is, and I've got that's like a snapshot from it, which shows you all the different initiatives that there are in actually trying to address things like this, like the Japanese JCM, but there's bilateral arrangements between a lot of countries as well. So countries are sort of gearing up for Article 6 to be ready for it. So because Doha amendment did come into force eventually, there is a true-up period. So when we don't know when it'll be. The CDM, as I said, so there's the options again. That's thanks to climate focus. What, you continue to Kyoto? Do you become? Does the CDM become Article 6.2? Does it become Article 6.4? We'll say a little bit about that in a minute, or does it just stop? It was recently awarded its 10 billionth credit, right? So that's all these contributions to the adaptation fund. I didn't say it at the time, but coming back from Marrakesh and presenting this to my colleagues in the legal office, you know, the financial co-financing division in the legal office, you know, the finance lawyers, I said, so, you know, you're going to have to look at this share of the proceeds, and the chief counsel just blanched and said, "This is a nightmare. You know, these are tradable assets with them which you have to monetize. The risks are horrible." So he wrote a legal opinion on the risks, and it's actually annexed to the decision setting up the adaptation fund, appointing the trustee. It's like 4 or 5 pages of risks, and you know, because you have to monetize. You have to change the CRs into money in order to be able to spend it, and at a time when there's a lot of fluctuation in the markets. So there is going to be an ongoing need for offsets, right? The CDM is an offsetting regime. Offsetting is kind of bad news. We need to think in terms of reductions, not of offsetting our reductions by doing something else. But there will still be needs for offsetting. We aren't going to have, I suspect, in the near future, completely solar or battery-driven aeroplanes, and we will start getting back into planes, hopefully, within the next 12 months. And so if we don't, then you're going to have to offset some of the emissions from that. And there's this new scheme that was not new particularly, but the scheme called CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for civil aircraft, which offsets, so it has a mechanism for that. So there'll be other offsetting niche markets as well. So does that become part of the CDM? So that's one of the big questions, of the Article 6. And look at all these other things that are going on. So there is now a real market for CO2 for buying emissions. I was meant to look at quickly to see what the price was. The task I set my students, and I meant to do that this morning. It's a bit early for me this morning still, and I didn't have a chance to do it. But it's like 30 plus $30 to $40 now. So we're way up into the figure that the Secretary General's advisory group set up. So that's all happening now without being mobilized into the Article 6. And there we see, this is, I can't see the edge of my screen here, but it's like 61 schemes now, just up 25%, if you like, of emission reduction. So, you know, emission commitments. So that's of emissions, not emission reductions. So there are we're only a quarter of emissions, but that's still pretty, and it's increased quite a lot recently. So financial issues then, outstanding issues. So again, I haven't been following this as closely as the others have, and I know Christina and Petra are going to be talking about these in detail, so I'll leave that for them. But the things which are obvious that's going to have to be looked at, one is the transparency requirement, which Christina mentioned, and Dan talked about that last time. There is Article 2.1 of Paris talks about making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And how do we know whether that's happening, right? And this is the issue of, if you like, of mistrust a bit about it. I mean, there's a lot of money that's being mobilized, but let's just have it more transparently made obvious. As you know, Jake Workman's phrase, is it difficult to make sense of the figures? And also the target, the 100 billion a year target. Now, again, I've got a couple of slides just to show different views on that. We've got loss and damage still. It's an ongoing issue, but still on the table. And then the key issue is determining how these markets will work. So a few words about that. First of all, this is the Development Assistance Committees, the OECD's figure. Says that in 2018 it was about 78.9 billion. Figures before that leading up to it, heavily disputed by many. The Oxfam says it's less than half that, and the Indian government, which commissioned, says like a third, even less than that. So these are the figures. These are the DAC figures, and you can see. And again, we have to decide what finance means. So the Oxfam was saying that some of these figures involve not even concessional lending, but lending at market rates for projects. So is that included? We don't know that. Those, you can see who the biggest donors here are. It's quite interesting, but again, a little bit more transparency now isn't going to do any harm to anybody. A few words about Paris. I mean, we remember that there are three mechanisms in Article 6. Article 6.2 talks about voluntary cooperation on internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, which contribute towards the nationally determined contributions to promote sustainable development, etc. That looks a little bit like JI, but we perhaps not look back through the lenses. We should be looking at this in a new way, but we haven't got any indication of that yet. And Article 6.4 talks about a mechanism. So a CDM is a mechanism. So is this a mechanism like CDM? People have dubbed it the Sustainable Development Mechanism, possibly. But it talks about a mechanism to trade credits from emission reductions generated through projects to contribute to mitigation and to support sustainable development. Interesting, sustainable development in Article 12 of the Kyoto comes first, but that's interesting, isn't it? Aims to facilitate participation by public and private entities to do overall mitigation, ensure share of the proceeds. So it looks a bit like the CDM, but obviously it isn't. And then we have a new mechanism, which is a non-market approach, which we don't know anything about at all. Or I don't know anything about, but that may not be the bar that we're looking at. So these are the issues we have to look at. 6.2, how do we look at accounting, in sustainable development and environmental integrity. Those are the governance issues. And these are all the same issues for 6.4, really. How will it be run? Will there be a board like the executive board of the CDM? How will the share of proceeds be allocated? What's the relationship between 6.2 and 6.4? For example, if there's a share of proceeds requirement for 6.4, but not for 6.2, everybody will go to 6.2, not 6.4. So there's sort of equity between the two to make sure that the system is going to work most efficiently. And maybe some lessons from the CDM is not to be too bureaucratic. On the one hand, it has to be certified, but it's the CDM is a little bit. There have been lots of proposals for its reform. And 6.8, we don't really know anything about that at all. And then we have to look at CDM, JI moving forward. So we have some setbacks. One, of course, is the pandemic effect, which I put last, but really should be first. I think that's the whole thing of the meeting from last year being postponed. We still need clarity on COP, on key issues, which weren't provided by Madrid or or previously. 31 countries have come out with these principles for high ambition and integrity, which is sort of slightly at odds with some of the negotiations. And so what do we need? So political will, we've got to do this. There has to be a sort of, which I think there's one of the enthusiasms coming up to Glasgow is that there is some now, right, we had a bit of a relapse last year, but we need to really do this properly. I think the UK government, remember, there's some pressure to appoint the president early on. So Alex Sharma has been taking a pretty proactive role, as I understand. And the UK has had a number of dialogues, 80 of these online dialogues. They want to resolve these long-standing issues around about Paris markets governing Article 6. And then we need these robust accounting rules. So not only, but also about the issues of allocation of debt, about donor allocations as well. So my thanks to Doug, I already mentioned her, and also to Marcus Pullman at the World Bank, who actually helped me with some of the figures. And I'm happy to take questions, as long as they're not too difficult. As I said to Nilufer, I can, our friend Tullio Scavazzi, Professor Scavazzi, says, I'll answer easy questions. If they're too difficult, I'll turn off my camera and sulk. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. I have to say that it's to get this type of overview from the very beginning of a very complex area, the finances, there's so many funds, how they operate, and you really gave us detail and also insight because you had experience from the World Bank. And I think you really showed the evolution that's take place between the World Bank, the GEF, and now heading to the Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund, and now, of course, where we are with Paris and the still open questions. So I have to, say that really we got you gave a very clear, for someone like me who is not very adept with financial and fund and numbers, I think it was really extraordinary, and I thank you. And I know we have questions, and we do welcome questions. And I'll see if there are easy ones, David. And I see someone we know, Benoit. It's related to the CDM, and which kind of, I'm going to sneak in my own question on the CDM. The question has to do with what's the difference between primary and secondary CDM. Right. But I want to ask too, because as I recall, and that may have changed, the CDM, one of the issues though, was that most of it was going to one particular country. And there seemed to be an imbalance. Was that the case? And how do you think that in the Paris, if we do continue with this type of mechanisms, how that might be avoided? But again, more what's the difference between primary and secondary CDM as well? So that's
okay. Yeah, good. So, all right. So thanks. No, and I meant to, again, I had all this data up, and it's just trying not to spend too long on these issues. So thank you for that. That's really good questions. So basically, the primary market is where the CERs are actually generated, right? So you invest money in a project, the project delivers emission reductions, and they're certified, and then that's the market. So that's the initial purchase of them. So that's the figure from which the share of the proceeds is taken. Now, once you've got those, what do you do with them? You can set them off against your own. If you're a national government, you can set them off against your own emissions. If you're a private sector company, you may be able to set them off against your own company's emissions, or you may just want to sell them. And that's where the secondary market comes in. And so that, of course, there's no share of the proceeds from that. So there's no public take, if you like, from that market. And it's substantially bigger, you see. So the figures were the same emission reductions can be sold 3 or 4 times. So that's where the price, the total amounts go up. But so that's why the figure for secondary markets is higher than the first one. But the first one is important for us because that's where the share of the proceeds. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Then the next issue is a really good one, and I didn't look at the star allocation system under the GF. I thought this was too early on in what I was saying, and it's getting a little bit too bogged down. But one of the problems that was raised early on in the early days, and I'll come back to CDM, but this is just to give you an idea of how this is a problem. They opened up shop, and then let's have some projects, right? So the countries that got the money were the ones who were well organized, got their acts together and made good proposals, which hit all the buttons that that were required by the structure, by the GF and by the Framework Convention. And that meant that a number of countries were beginning to get disproportionate shares. And so in 2005, I think it was the US under the Bush administration, the Treasury started to push for another resource allocation framework, ostensibly to be equitable, more to make sure that China didn't get too much. Is really the undercurrent for this, because they were well organized and they had cracked on the way in which to put forward good, well thought through projects. So that became a much more, now it's become now STAR, which is a standard. What does it stand for? Actually, make sure I had that written down. But it's the transparent allocation framework. So it's every replenishment, the amount of money which each country will get, eligible country will get, is actually set out on the table. So then that's depending on size, on needs, etc. So there's no suggestion of favoritism for one particular country. So that's how the GF worked. Now the CDM is the same. CDM though is a private sector driven as well. So again, they're looking at we've opened shop, so we're open for proposals. So would the good ones go through? And again, China started to come in with these with a number of projects, and a couple of them. I'm not very good on the. Help me with the particular chemical, but there's one particular chemical which is generated CF2287.
Oh yeah, chloro. Yeah,
that's right. So that's
long word.
Yeah, that's right. So as a byproduct of concrete production, apparently, and it's a factor of as a global warming potential is like 4,000 times that of CO2. So for each ton of CO2, that's 4,000 tons equivalent. So you reduce a ton of it and you've made a lot of money, right? And there was a suggestion that it was even worth building a factory to generate these in order to sell the emission reductions, which was madness. So after 2 of these projects, the CDMs, they were not going to do any more of those. So, and those both were in China. So that's the sort of part of that there isn't, you have to, if you have a system, you get rules, people play the rules, right? So, but this is we have the idea of guaranteeing, I think environmental integrity of these things is as important as generating finances for that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, those are wonderful answers. We have a question here, and I think it came perhaps when you had not gone through the entire presentation, but let me ask it from Ahmed Sukma. Are there any financial funds other than the GIF, Green Climate Fund, and CIF? But you did go through a number of other ones, and I presume that's for climate change. But did you want to add anything else, David, perhaps?
No, I mean, yeah, I think I've already gone to far too many already. I mean, it's quite detailed stuff. I wanted to, I'm trying not to get, but I mean, there may be private investment funds as well. I'm looking more at the public sector.
I think this question came before because I think you mapped it out. There's so many funds actually. And now we see what will come up after in the future. Here we have from Linda Siegel. Given the financial burden that particularly vulnerable developing countries are being and will be faced with to combat climate change, it is understandable that public funds will not be enough and that leveraging private funds is essential. Where is the guarantee that this will actually happen at the required scale? If you can answer that. And what is the prognosis for global taxation's regime, in brackets, on the upcoming G7 agenda for shoring up the public-private funding? And I think the whole issue of private funding, of course, is always been, one of the debated issues. So that is a big question, but I'm sure it's an easy one for you, David.
Well, it's not an easy question, but I won't sulk. It's a good question, and the answer is there is no guarantee, right? I mean, that was the high level panel said, you need a mix of public and private sector. You can take the view that the public sector that the government should tax the private sector and then use the money from the taxes to pay its contribution. That's one way forward. Or you can use market mechanisms, actually incentivize the private sector to do good things, and that it costs them money, and then you tax that, as it were, in different ways. And that's really that's what the CDM and JI sort of approach is. But you've got no guarantee of the amounts of money that will be generated, but you can tell that the harder you turn the screws, the more restrictions as the regime for emission reductions becomes more restrictive, the price will go up, and so therefore the amounts of money involved will be higher. So therefore, that's if you like, the equivalent mechanisms to the share of the proceeds will be ways of trying to harvest some of that. But you also have to, if you're going to do that, you also need to be aware of the fact that you mustn't make your system too bureaucratic. And I think that's one of the criticisms that's been made of the CDM. I mean, I think the executive board has done a tremendous job over the years, but they are part-timers, right? They all have day jobs. They meet at a certain length of time. The suggestion was that this is actually such an important position, they should be full-time, so that delays of this can be addressed, and that you have a stricter sort of external auditing system. These are all the proposals to be made about reform of CDM, which have been made for the last 10 years. So that some lessons to be learned in actually designing, if we're going to call it the Sustainable Development Mechanism under 6.4, there are some lessons to be learned from that. On the one hand, you want it to be representative and you want it to be participatory, and you certainly want it to be transparent, but it also has to be transaction friendly. So that doesn't mean too long delays in processing, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And I think the point you say about what are the lessons learned, and I don't know how those are actually being incorporated into the evolving mechanisms and funds. Now I know from our own Christina that she actually also has a question, but remember, Christina, it has to be easy.
I'll try. Thank you so much, David. I have one comment and actually two very brief questions. The comment was your question on the assessment on the collective finance goal in Article 2, paragraph 1, letter C of the Paris Agreement. We have a comment by Tracy Bach as well with regard to the Standing Committee on Finance, but I just wanted to comment that this is actually part of the global stock takes mandate, which takes stock of collective progress against all the goals of the Paris Agreement, including that particular one. Now, the next, the first global stock take is in 2023, so that's the first time we maybe see some numbers on that particular issue. My question, two very brief questions. You went into quite detail on the GCF. My question is with regard to results-based finance. We only have seen the GCF taking up results-based finance with regard to forest, REDD+, but it hasn't really, as a financial concept, spread to other areas than forest. And I just wanted to ask you what you think about it. Why is it confined to REDD? Why hasn't it not be duplicated in other sectors, for example? And very briefly on 9.5. You may have seen that a number of developed countries have put forward their projected levels of finance to developing countries, which are now available on the website. It's a very current development. And I just wanted to ask you whether you had a look at it, what you think about it. Could it also be a negative incentive putting forward your projected levels of finance? Could that be something that actually reduces the available levels of finance, or is it something that may increase the financial transfers to come to developing countries?
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks. I'll take the last one first because it's slightly easier. Because I looked and I couldn't find it. So I know that there's requirements for ex ante and and ex post assessments of your contributions. I know I've seen the EU proposals that they made, but I tried to find the navigating the Framework Convention website is a sort of like a PhD process in itself, and even with my able assistance of Dugu, I couldn't find it. So that's going to be one of the things, being more transparent, to put it up there. But I think it's a great idea. I think that's nice. If you're actually saying, then you can measure governments against what they say they're going to do and whether they actually did it, and they have to show that they did it. So I think this idea of actually putting this up, so stop the smoke and mirrors issue, right, is a really good idea, and to have it up there in black and white. And some of the countries have, and I'm a Brit, but the UK government has made a pretty substantial contributions to that. I mean, they just apparently dropped back. I think they may have gone back on that decision, but I heard that they'd gone back on their commitment to 0.7 GDP commitment to ODA, that they were going to drop it to 0.5. But I heard that, again, I was just looking for that yesterday. I couldn't find the evidence of that, but there is a lot of governments. Norwegian government deserves a lot of credit, etc., for the amounts of money they put into these mechanisms. So I think it's absolutely to be welcomed, and I like the idea of ex ante and ex post as well. So that's the first. So so there's also a recommendation to try and make the Framework Convention website a little bit more user friendly. The search statistics facility is a bit of a nightmare. I know it's got such an amazing amount of stuff on it that it is an amazing site. Results based is really difficult, right? Because this is the transparent equal access issue, right? And that's where the pushback against the star allocation for the GF was, we should reward those who can offer global benefits in an easy way at the cheapest options, right? So countries that put forward proposals which meet our criteria and which offer global benefits, those are the ones that should be rewarded. It's not the question of allocating the money and tying it up with countries, some of which haven't got the capacity or interested in doing it. Neither of those arguments are particularly appealing in toto on one side or the other, but somewhere in the middle is where we go with that. But results-based is, so I think it has a particular appeal for forests, because if we're looking at the preservation of existing forests, your financing should depend on whether you're actually going to be able to do it, right? So it works for forests. For other areas, I'm less sure, but I haven't seen it being used in other areas.
All right. Lots of complimentary comments here. Quite a few questions, and I have to say that some of them are showing financial knowledge, but I'm going to play a little favoritism, and we have them from a common friend, Nick Robinson. So I'm going to select him, and I will get to the other questions as well. First, superb overview, which I agree. And the question is, how might or should the debates on finance in Glasgow reflect the debates in separate negotiations? Example, how to handle sovereign debt, converting it to a fund to apply to climate. Yesterday's UN Sustainable Goal Statement, or the UN Sustainable Goal commitments, DD&8s. I don't like abbreviations. These cross-cutting finance concerns in the past have been compartmentalized, and it is unclear how intersectoral issues will be handled. Is it not? So this is from Nick.
So just yes. Would be an answer to that. So thank you, Nick. Yeah. Yes, is probably not just an acceptable reply, but certainly thank you for comments. Charlotte Streck, who I'm a great admirer of, said that the problem with it's 194 parties talking about 194 issues at the same time, right? I mean, that's part of the negotiation. There's so many balls in the air at these negotiations and so many concerns. It becomes very complicated, which is why it's taken such a long time. I think that's a great idea. The idea of compounding sovereign debt and using it in a way that can be addressed for climate issues. But I don't think that's what the Framework Convention should do. I think that's something that should be done outside the ambit of UNFCCC. To be frank, that others may take different views. That's my, it's just, let's not make the debate more complicated than it already is.
Yeah, keep it simple.
It's good to remember that that option is up, that those proposals are on the table. So thanks to Nick for flagging that.
And here I have a question from Nora Gallagher, and it's a very short question. How will CDM be transitioned into Paris Agreement commitments?
I think yes is the answer to that. No, that's the we don't know, do we?
We don't know exactly. Yeah, that's the question. All right.
So what I did say was it hasn't been as successful as we'd hoped, right? It's 2 billion over 20 years, right? So there's a lot of credits, but it could have been more, and that's not the fault of the executive board, but it's the fault, if you like, of the financial situation and market forces and political drivers for this process. But if we have to have a system that's similar, we can learn some lessons from that, and we shouldn't. I think there's a case for either absorbing it into the Article 6 form mechanism, or at least preserving it maybe as a separate offsetting mechanism. I think offsetting we're sort of past offsetting for most of us in terms of developed country commitments. We're looking at reductions now, right? If we were going to keep within the targets, the temperature reduction targets, we can't be paying somebody else to take our pollution. We need to be addressing it seriously ourselves. But there are certain circumstances where they can't be done, like I mentioned over aircraft. So if we want to continue flying, we have to address that pretty seriously. So it's a big issue for them to decide still.
All right, so we have 5 more minutes, so I'll take whatever questions we can in that time. Here's one that I think seems interesting from Joshua Sarnoff. How does the funding and particularly the spending get operationalized in the various mechanisms in regard to the common but differentiated responsibilities principles in the UNFCCC?
Gulp. I'm going to turn my camera off. Good question. All right. So
is that a hard one? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Basic principle here is that the differentiation arises in relation to the obligations you take on, right? One of which is for the developed countries to provide Annex 2 countries to provide funding, right? So that's these funds are already the product of this common differentiated responsibility, right? Because that's the differentiated responsibility that the developed countries, the Annex 2 countries, have taken on. So that's that's the first step. So once we come to the project implementation, then it's all being done in developing countries. So I don't see that there's the whole of this operation is then part of that differentiated responsibility, because they're getting access to concessionary financing and grant financing as a result of the fact that they're the recipients of that differentiation. Is that addressing the question that I think that was the point.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer. So, so we have very few time left, and the questions that are remaining are rather complicated. So I think I will just read some of the thank you messages, David. So we have from Bradley Martzigala. This has been such a great session. Really appreciated the timeline explaining the journey to where we are today. And thank you to the organizers, but thank you, of course, to Professor Freestone. Thanks to Professor Freestone and the panelists for an excellent and comprehensive presentation. Thank you, Professor Freestone, again. And also saying it's a great follow-up to Professor Bodansky. And I think we really have come, there's many more questions, I know, and they're rather complex ones, and I don't think the next 2 minutes would give us enough time. Maybe we'll have to have you back, and we'll send you these questions. I know there's been a request for your PowerPoint. If we can share that, But really, I agree. This is one of the most difficult parts of the climate process, the finance, the funds, and you really just gave us this wonderful, timeline overview and really explained it very clearly to someone such as myself, who really tries to avoid the numbers game, frankly. So thank you so much, David, and thank you, Christina and Petra as well, and all the participants. We really appreciate your joining us for the second lecture series. And I apologize again to those I was not able to get to your questions. They were really very good questions, but we will share them with David. And as I said, maybe we can have a follow-up. So we hope that in actually just 1 week, the third lecture for our series is our very own Christina Voigt. And that is going to be a fantastic lecture as well, on compliance and transparency. So we hope to see you all again on April 9th with us. And of course, David, you have a standing invitation to all our lectures as well. So at this point, I can just say good night.